Secretary to His Excellency the President, Mr. Lalit Veeratunga, Secretary to the Ministry of Defence and Urban Development, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, Your Excellencies, High Commissioners and Ambassadors, Chief of Defence Staff, General Jagat Jayasuriya, Commander of the Army, Lieutenant General Daya Ratnayaka, Commander of the Navy, Vice Admiral Jayanath Kolamagi, Commander of the Air Force, Air Marshal Harsha Bevikrama, Director General Civil Defence Force, Rear Admiral Anand Piris, past service commanders, distinguished guest speakers and delegates from across the world, dear colleagues from the tri-services in Sri Lanka, ladies and gentlemen. Addressing such an august gathering is definitely a rare privilege for me, and presenting the role of the military in reconciliation is a timely opportunity, and I cherish both. Reconciliation means several things to different people. Therefore, during my endeavor today, I will essentially pull together some thoughts on reconciliation and then move on to present the Sri Lankan perspective on the role of the military in reconciliation. The term reconciliation is often shrouded in confusion, and any discourse on the role of the military in reconciliation adds controversy to that confusion. What is most common in reconciliation is that no one understands or agrees on how to define it or do it. The absence of consensus is observed not only among scholars and their writings, but is reflected in policy circles, within governments, donor agencies, and so on. It also finds parallels among most sectors in the real post-conflict context, such as victims, offenders, religious and cultural organizations. Paradoxically, while the confusion remains, the term gains steadily in usage and importance. Amidst this variance, there is explicit consensus on several features of reconciliation. There is no perfect reconciliation method or model that is applicable universally. Therefore, those who face the challenge of post-conflict peace building should trust their own capacity to take whatever advice they get from elsewhere and be creative in developing their own original model. It is a long-term process and there is no quick fix. It is a deep process which demands changes in aspirations, emotions, feelings, and even beliefs. It is also a very broad process which applies not only to those who suffered and those who inflicted the suffering, but also to the community-wide element. An exploration of the effect of reconciliation in conflict resolution during the last century reveals that 64% of the countries where a reconciliation event occurred did not experience a subsequent violent conflict. On the contrary, only 9% of the countries where a reconciliation process did not occur avoided a return to conflict. So, its significance is established, although there is no consensus on what the term encompasses, what it excludes, where it links with other post-conflict initiatives, and how it functions. During my presentation, I will revisit the definition of reconciliation, the traditional and contemporary frameworks for reconciliation, along with the role of the military therein, and discuss the role of the military in reconciliation in Sri Lanka, culminating in the Sri Lankan model. In the most simple terms, reconciliation is a process through which a society moves from a divided past to a shared future. Although this definition is general, it nonetheless captures the essence of reconciliation the most effectively. Building on it, David Bloomberg introduces 4 tightly linked, cross-cutting, and interdependent elements. These elements are important as they provide a sense of direction on the way forward to reconciliation. He ponders further on a 5th element. This in particular translates into sustaining the enduring process of reconciliation. It underpins success, especially in the current context. The traditional framework for reconciliation that impressed me is a hybridization of several different authors and institutions within the field of reconciliation studies. It relies on 4 dimensions. These dimensions help to better organize and understand the methods employed in reconciliation. From this framework, 2 general categories emerge: structural methods and psychological methods. Structural reconciliation concerns the structural aspects of a society's political, legal, economic, and security systems. While structural measures are relatively straightforward and necessary, they usually cannot effect a successful reconciliation process that leads to a stable peace on their own. Psychological methods involves the more complex domain of emotional healing, spiritual considerations, cultural identities and narratives, and cognitive perceptions. While most reconciliation frameworks do not distinguish between the 2 categories, it makes sense to do so in order to avoid concentrating on one while neglecting the other. The universal perception on the role of military in reconciliation is conflicting. This is what the proponents of the traditional framework have to say about it. These arguments emanate from post-conflict experience in South Africa and Northern Ireland. The more contemporary review on the role of the military in reconciliation is at the other extreme. It draws inspiration from the military surge in Iraq in 2007 and its initial success. It advocates an armed reconciler performing a forcing function and advances the notion of armed reconcilers who can push a society towards reconciliation. Now, I will not juxtapose this with the foundational principles of reconciliation or the outcome in Iraq, but rather leave it to your comprehension. With that background, let me now move on to the role of the military in reconciliation in Sri Lanka. As Daniel and Bennick notes, psychological reconciliation usually begins before the cessation of hostilities. Sri Lanka is no exception. The reconciliation process commenced much before the conflict ended. The government had to address distinct needs of the society at crucial stages, without which the hope of reconciliation would only be an illusion. These timely interventions afforded the space and opened the path for the reconciliation process. I will now go through these specific interventions. By 2009, the Tamil community in the north was trapped in the clutches of the insurgents and was beginning to dissipate. Let us now recapture that hopelessly grim situation that prevailed at that time as portrayed by the free media. The footage is from an aerial vehicle. As such, I urge you to bear with the picture quality.
Waves upon waves of civilians have been flooding into government-controlled areas from early this morning when security forces broke through the last LTTE band in Pudumadalan. Footage obtained today by unmanned aerial vehicles of the Air Force shows armed LTTE cadres attempting to prevent large groups of civilians from moving towards government territory by shooting at them. Footage also reveals the LTTE using battle tanks within the safe zone to attack security forces that have taken up defensive positions. This desperate bid by the LTTE to block the movement towards freedom of the very people whose freedom they espouse is a dastardly act and must be condemned in the strongest possible sense. The mass exodus has so far seen over 91,000 Tamil civilians pour into government-controlled areas, where security forces are now carrying out their registration and providing them with food and medical care. While the LTTE's propaganda machine is in overdrive to convince the international community, including sections of its media, of its good conduct by blaming the security forces for attacks inside the safe zone, the footage is proof that it is the LTTE which is marking its dying days by haphazardly targeting innocent civilians already downtrodden by years of living under its control.
Now, this is when the Sri Lankan society intervened to redeem the community in captivity. The intervention was obviously spearheaded by the military. The military launched an unprecedented rescue operation in contemporary history across the now famous Nandikanal Lagoon for the besieged to access the rest of the nation. They moved across from a state of fear to a state of non-violence. Reconciliation is an institutional imperative. The military transited from an institution of ceremonial paraphernalia to the defensive, to the offensive, and to humanitarian well-being over a period of 3 decades. The military transformed from victor to reconciler instantly as the besieged walked across the lagoon. The simple act of former suspiciously separated parties meeting over a shared meal tendered a great deal of ice-breaking of unfounded fears and hatred, igniting the hope of reconciliation. The empathy that emanated may have sown the seeds of confidence among the suspicious to be encouraged to enter the healing process that was to follow, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. The military in Sri Lanka led the way by example for all other institutions to move from a feeling of war and violence to a feeling of peace and freedom through the spontaneous transformation from victor to frontline reconciler, a foreground catalyst in the reconciliation process. The physically and psychologically shattered community that emerged was wrapped into a mono-ethnic single narrative of separatism. Separatism sought only through violence, an appetite for violence that obscured the enticing mechanisms incorporated into the Indo-Lanka Agreement, an appetite of violence that instigated the elimination of generations of moderates of their own community. The military, which is part of Sri Lankan society and represents all what the big society goes through, was the first to engage them with a cross-cutting understanding of a nation of many cultures, many religions, and many ethnicities. The engagement was the first taste of coexistence of hitherto polarized entities. The military did not stop there. It went beyond to restore the strongest indigenous structure of the state, the civil administrative service. The public servants who played a subservient role towards the insurgents were duly recognized of their standing in civil administrative service of Sri Lanka instantly and were encouraged and partnered by the military to discharge their duties without fear or favor for the benefit of the population they were appointed to serve. They linked the community with the rest of the stakeholders in the reconciliation process. The movement from fear to nonviolence and the acceptance of coexistence did not mean much. The community which was rescued was displaced. A considerable area of land was left contaminated with landmines by the end of the conflict in 2009. This denied the displaced access to their homes, it denied access for agencies willing to assist in recovery, and it prevented rehabilitation, reconstruction, and essential infrastructure. It even rendered the Tamil political leadership based in the south somewhat inaccessible to the community. This is when the military stepped in again, as already brought out by the Secretary to His Excellency the President. The military was partnered this time by several agencies in an ambitious humanitarian demining campaign. The military deminers spearheaded the effort, clearing 95% of the contaminated area within a period of less than 3 years. The military virtually opened the gateway for the rest of the nation and the rest of the world for rapid political, economic, and social engagement, a movement from security to freedom, without which no amount of desire for reconciliation would have meant anything. The impact was enormous. Nearly 300,000 displaced were united with their families, resettled, and provided with amenities such as education, vocational training, and livelihood. Approximately 12,000 ex-combatants who surrendered were taken care of, de-radicalized, rehabilitated, and reintegrated into society, all through an indigenous model developed by the military and partnered by the civil society in its application. 4 years into post-conflict now, the structural aspects of political, administrative, legal, and economic systems are functioning and are being streamlined. The psychological aspects are gradually gaining ground. The role of the frontline reconciler is fading away. The military evolves to suit contemporary threats to national security. And you will have a deep insight to this during the first session tomorrow. The global drivers of conflict will remain as sources of instability, pushing parties towards persistent conflict, complicating international relations. They will create a state of uncertainty within and outside the region. Sri Lanka will not be spared of this phenomena, and the military will continue to promote peace through security and stability, and will enable economic growth to outlive the enduring process of reconciliation. All these interventions, when put together in abstract, constructs the Sri Lankan model of the role of the military in reconciliation. I like to call it I3. I3 because it is all about imperatives, and the resultant impact. Imperatives that were necessitated by the particular circumstances that prevailed in Sri Lanka at that time. And so I name it. Now, the functioning of this model depends upon the push-pull engagement between the military and the rest of the stakeholders. The engagement thrives on a whole-of-a-government coordinated approach where each partner understands the capabilities of and the limitations of the other. Moreover, every partner supports and encourages each other's role play as necessitated by the prevailing circumstances. Now, the reconciliatory imperatives which are in the center of the model and the transformational imperative on the right deliver the social impact on the left, which are benchmarks in the spectrum of reconciliation. My discourse today will not be complete if I do not refer to the most common concerns on the role of the military in reconciliation in Sri Lanka. So I will touch upon it briefly. First, why did the military engage in the reconciliation process. It was a matter of capacity, versatility, and access. The long-drawn conflict weakened the administrative structures in the north. These structures in situ lacked the capacity to cope with post-conflict demands. The military was the most reliable alternative that had the capacity and the versatility to cope with the demands of the post-conflict situation. The military exploited its inherent flexibility to assist in regenerating the capacity of the government structures. Further, accessibility of, or lack of it, was hindering the reach of the rest of the stakeholders. The military had to open the gateway, which was arduous and time-consuming. Second, was the military engagement in the reconciliation process justified? The military was engaged within the provisions of the laws of the land that provide for the military to assist the civil authority in activities such as rehabilitation, reconstruction, and resettlement, all leading into the reconciliation process. Therefore, the military in Sri Lanka was compelled to tread into the unknown territory of reconciliation due to the sheer circumstances. If not for the experience gained by pioneering the process, we too would have been carried away by the notion that the military has little or no relevance in the process of reconciliation. The Sri Lankan model proves otherwise. I will not contradict myself by proposing its potential for replication. Nevertheless, it may inspire global military and political leadership somewhere, sometime. In conclusion, let me draw your attention to a quote by His Excellency Mahinda Rajapaksa, the President of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, which epitomizes the nature of the role of the military in pioneering the reconciliation process in Sri Lanka. We in the military in Sri Lanka cannot wish for a better compliment than that. Thank you very much.